All right, so it's time to update our special stats page that we created in a previous lesson. So let's go and let's look at that first. So if we're to click on one of our responses here on surveys, it'll take us to the stats page, and we can see that the survey ID is being passed in here, but nothing is happening. We have this drop down, but nothing happens. So let's fix that. Let's go to our code editor now. And what we want to do is find our stats page function, which is in admin pages section 8, and it's the second function there, 8.2. All right, so I'm going to completely update this function. I'm going to start by querying all of the surveys from the database, and I'm calling WordPress's built-in function getPosts to do that. So what it does is it takes a couple of arguments in an associative array, and then we'll return an array of posts from the database that match those arguments. So in this case, we're searching for posts in the database that are our custom post type, SSP_survey. We want to grab only posts that have a post status of published or draft. And post per page, this is, we set this to -1, which will mean just grab all of the posts. Otherwise, WordPress has built-in pagination for posts, and it'll display a certain number of posts per page based on a URL variable. But in this case, we're just going to grab them all. Then we're passing in the order by argument. This is going to just order the posts by the post title, and the order is going to be ascending. So that'll all get saved in our variable called surveys. After that, we want to get the selected survey. So we're doing this by grabbing the URL variable. And again, that's this variable up here that's being passed in. So this is what's called the get scope. So we're using the get scope, and we're checking to see here if the survey ID is set in that scope. If it is, we return that as the value, and we cast it as an integer. Otherwise, we return 0. After that, we're going to run an if statement. So we're going to check if there are surveys by counting the amount of items in our surveys array that got from our get post query. So it's going to return items if it found some. So if count is greater than 1, then we're going to run some code. So here's where we're going to build out our select HTML. That's that input. So we want to include all of the surveys in that drop-down input. So here we go. We start by setting up a variable called select HTML, and it has a label that says selected survey. And then we open up our select tag. We give it a name of SSP survey, and then our first option is going to be select one. Now we use a for each loop to loop over each of our surveys in the array that we got from get posts, and each item that we loop through we're going to set here as survey. So inside our loop, we're checking to see if the current survey is selected. So we're comparing it with the variable that was passed into the URL or the get scope. So here we set selected to be an empty string by default, and then we check to see, hey, is the current survey's ID number equal to our selected survey ID, which is the variable that we set up here. If it is, we're going to set up selected to be equal to this text here, which is a HTML attribute for our input. So selected equals selected. And then after that, we are going to append our option that we've just created here to our select HTML. So here we're using the .equal syntax to append, and we're setting up a new option with a value of this current survey ID, and then we're adding in the selected attribute. So again, if it's not selected, this will just be an empty string. Otherwise, it'll be selected equals selected. And then in between our option, we're including the survey's post title, and that's going to be the name of our survey that we set up. So this loop will loop over all of the surveys that we have in our database and add them to our select HTML. Then at the bottom of this loop, after we finish looping, we're going to close up our select input now. All right, so lastly, what we want to do is echo the output. Oh, before we do that though, we want to do an else statement here. So if the count If there are surveys, we're going to build that select. If there aren't surveys, we're going to set up our select HTML to be the text. You don't have any surveys yet. Why not? And then we're going to use admin URL to include a link to the create new surveys page there. All right, so then below that, what we want to do is we're going to set up an empty div tag for our survey stats. So we're going to set that in a variable called stats.html. Then we're going to check again if the selected survey ID is greater than 0, so there is a valid survey. And if there is, we're going to set our stats.html to be equal to the result of our function that we previously created, getStats.html here. And then we're going to pass in the selected survey ID into that. So then after that, we want to build our output string. So here we go, we set up a div tag with a class of wrap. And this is like what our page looked like before, except now we're including these new variables in here. So again, class wrap and SSP stats admin page. Title is still survey statistics, and then in our p tag, our first p tag is going to include our select input, and we use our select HTML that we just built. And then below that, we're going to display the stats for the current selected survey with our stats HTML there. And then at the very bottom, we're going to return the output by using echo, and we're going to echo the output. Okay, cool. So that's our new stats page code. So now we're calling a new function called getStatsHTML, this one right here. So we need to create that. So let's go to our helpers, and our last helper was 6.7 here. So below that, hit return a couple times. And we're going to create a new function 6.8, and this is that function. It's called Ajax getStatsHTML. So this is going to be an Ajax handler here. So this function gets stats.html for a given survey, returning it inside of a JSON data string. And this function is an Ajax form handler, so it expects post data in the post scope. It's looking for survey ID specifically. So we set up our result array here by default with status to 0. Message is going to be could not get stats.html, and then the HTML string is going to be an empty string by default. Then we get the survey ID using our shorthand if-else statement here. So if the post survey ID is set in the post scope, then we're going to set that as the value, and we're going to cast as an integer. Otherwise, we're going to set it to 0. We store that in a variable called survey ID. So we then, after that, we use an if statement to check if the survey ID is greater than 0, then it'll equal true. Then we set up our new result array to be status of 1, message is stats.html received successfully, and the HTML is going to be the result of our function SSP getStatsHTML. And that we're going to pass in the survey ID for that. Then we're going to return the results as a JSON string using our previously created function, the SSP return JSON function. So this function calls this new helper here, getStatsHTML. So let's create that now. That we're going to create that right below this function. So it's going to be 6.9. So here it is. This function returns HTML containing the survey stats data. So it takes in the survey ID. We start by setting up our output string as a div tag. It's going to be an empty div tag here. So then we check to see if the survey ID is greater than 0, then we're going to generate some HTML. So first we're going to get the question HTML by calling our previously created function getQuestionHTML here. And then after that, we're going to get the response count by calling getSurveyResponses as well. Then we're going to build our output string, and it's going to include the question HTML and the responses in it. And in fact, I just noticed that we should probably set up question HTML and responses by default above here. So let's do that so it doesn't throw an error. Okay, so now there's defaults for these values, because if this was false, then these wouldn't get set up, and then when we try to create our output string here, these variables wouldn't exist. So that's why we did that there. So we build our output here. We wrap everything with a div of a class of SSP survey stats, and then the first thing we include is the question HTML, and then we include the responses. You'll notice up here where we're getting the question HTML, we're passing the second argument true. That's what we, well, let's go look at that right now. So the function is get question HTML. So the second argument is force results. So force results is going to give us the results, the statistics, even though we may have not answered that survey. So that's what we're passing in. We're saying give us the results by setting force results to true. All right, so lastly, we just return the output. So we still need to get WordPress's permission to access our previously created function. That's the Ajax get stats HTML function here. Because we're going to be requesting this with Ajax, we need to get permission for that from WordPress. So we're going to update our hooks now. So let's go to hooks, and we're going to update hooks 1.5 here, where we have our Ajax function set up. So we're going to add in a new one here. And here we're just setting up WP Ajax, and then this is the new function, SSP Ajax get stats HTML. And this is the function to call. So add that in there. And just a note here, we're only adding it for admin users since this is only going to appear in the admin part of our plugin. We only need permissions for admin users, and we don't want to give website users access to this function. Now is a good time to update our table of contents, so let's do that. So we added a couple of helpers, so let's go add those in now. Awesome, so make sure you save your PHP file now, and let's go back into WordPress. And if we're on our surveys page here, we can jump to the responses. I have a few responses in my test survey, so I'm going to click on the 8 there. Now it takes me to the survey statistics page, and you can see, look at that, it pulled in the question and then the responses, the different values for each response, and then also the amount of participants. So now if we try to change to a different survey here, you can see our select box is pulling in the other surveys. If I try to select a different survey, nothing is happening. So we're going to fix that by adding some JavaScript to dynamically change this when we change the selected survey here. So go to your code editor now, and what we want to do is open up the JS folder in our plugin and the private ssp.js file. All right, so below our debug function here, and this should be SSP debug, I'm gonna put in some code and I'm gonna review it. So like our other JavaScript file, we're gonna set up our WP Ajax URL. This is exactly the same. This is just the path to the PHP file that handles Ajax requests in PHP. After that, we're going to bind a change event to our select dropdown, and we're going to target the particular page because we added a special class SSP stats admin page to the div wrapper that goes around our page content on that page. And we're going to say look for the input with the name of SSP survey. That's our select input. And here we're saying on the change event for this input, run this function. So we're passing E in the function here. That's just going to be the element that we're binding this to. So that's going to be the select element. So first we're going to get the survey ID by grabbing the selected option of that select dropdown. We do that by using jQuery here. We're targeting an option that is selected And then the second argument is inside of the element this, and this is equal to the item that we just selected here. So it's going to be the select input. So we're going to grab the selected option, and then we're going to call val, which is a function that's going to return the value of that option. So that'll give us the survey ID. Next here, for debugging purposes, we're just saying outputting selected survey and then the ID of the selected survey. Next, we're going to grab the stats div, which is that div that we set up on our page by calling we're looking for an element that has a class of SSP survey stats inside of our stats admin page here. So that's what that is. So now we're going to create our AJAX to request the updated HTML. So we set the caching to be false. Method is going to be post. The URL is going to be our WP AJAX URL plus. We're going to pass in a URL variable called action, which is going to be equal to the function that we're sending the request to, and that's our AJAX function getStatsHTML. We're expecting JSON data back, so data type is JSON, and then for our data that we're posting to that function, we're just passing in the survey ID, so that's what this is here, and then we're passing in survey ID, which we grabbed up here. So if our AJAX request is successful, we'll get a JSON response back. Here we're just using our debug function to output that response to our JavaScript console just for debugging. And then after that, we check to see if the response status value is greater than 0, then we want to update the stats div. We're going to replace the HTML with our responses HTML that's being passed in through our response. Otherwise, we're going to display an alert message using the message inside of our response. And if an error happens, we're just dumping the error information. So that's our new JavaScript there. So we can save this file. And now let's go back here and let's just reload this page to make sure the new JavaScript loads in. Now let's try changing the survey, and we see the stats update automatically as well as the survey question there. So there you have it. We now have a functioning stats page. So in the next lecture, we're going to complete our welcome page, and so stay tuned for that.